The door slammed open with a force that rattled the house. Two police officers stood there, their faces stone cold as they handed me an ultimatum I couldn't understand. Before I could ask a single question, my wife, in full uniform, stepped out onto the porch, her badge gleaming in the sunlight, her eyes locked onto theirs. Their jaws dropped. The air thickened. They weren't expecting this. And neither was I. What happened next wasn't just about offense. It was about power, control, and a battle I never saw coming. Welcome back to Confessions of HOA. If you're new here, make sure to like and subscribe. It was an ordinary morning, one of those peaceful weekends when everything feels calm and the kids are still asleep. I was sipping my coffee, gazing out the window at the neighborhood, thinking about the usual chores ahead. My wife, Sarah, was in the kitchen, prepping breakfast. Life had its little routines, and honestly, I was grateful for them. But then, the doorbell rang. It wasn't the usual kind of knock. I immediately knew something was off. It was too early for a delivery, and none of the neighbors ever dropped by unannounced. I walked to the door, pulling it open, and there they were. Two police officers standing in front of me, looking serious. "Can I help you?" I asked, genuinely confused. "We need to speak with the owner of the property," one of the officers said, glancing at his notepad. His voice was firm, almost rehearsed. The other officer stood silently beside him, arms crossed. "Is there a problem?" I asked, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. They didn't respond directly, just handed me a piece of paper, some kind of official document from the HOA. They were demanding that I attend an urgent, serious conversation. The words were vague, but the tone was unmistakable. The HOA had sent them, and they meant business. "Why are you involved?" I asked, my mind racing. "What's going on?" The officer didn't answer at first. He simply nodded toward the other officer, who stepped forward and cleared his throat. "We were instructed to bring this matter to your attention. Please ensure someone from your household is available for further discussion." I didn't get it. This wasn't just an HOA fine. This felt like an escalation. The thought lingered in my mind as I tried to process what was happening. They didn't even give me a chance to respond before they turned and walked away, their backs as stiff as their demeanor. I shut the door, still trying to wrap my head around the situation. Something was off, and it wasn't just the police showing up. There had to be more to it than a parking violation or a missed lawn inspection. But what they didn't know was that my wife, she was more than just the woman of the house. The knock at the door had triggered something far deeper than an HOA dispute. The truth was about to come out, and it wasn't going to go the way they expected. The tension in the air thickened, and I knew the next confrontation would leave the HOA gasping for air. The HOA had always been there, lurking in the background of our quiet neighborhood, but lately, they'd become something of a constant presence. Every small infraction seemed to be under their microscope. Too long on the grass, the wrong color on the mailbox, or even the fact that our trash cans were occasionally left out a few hours past pickup time. It didn't matter how small the issue was. If they could find something to fine you for, they would. It had been a slow burn, really. At first, the complaints were minor, just petty notices about keeping the lawn manicured and ensuring the mailbox was the approved shade of beige. I didn't think much of it. After all, we were just trying to live our lives like everyone else. But then it escalated. I remember the first real confrontation, our parking situation. One evening, I got home late from work, and there was a notice on the windshield of my car. The HOA had issued a fine for unauthorized parking. The problem? There was no issue with where I parked. I had been parking in the same spot for years. But the HOA president, Karen, had decided it was too close to the curb. She took it upon herself to decide what was appropriate. That was just the beginning. Every month, there was something new, a fine, a letter, an unexpected visit. My wife and I started to notice that every time we saw Karen, she was scrutinizing us more than anyone else in the neighborhood. It became obvious. She had a personal vendetta against us. Karen, the HOA president, was the kind of person who thrived on control. She had this need to impose her rules on everyone else, as if the neighborhood's very existence depended on her vision of perfection. She didn't just live by the rules, she enforced them with an iron fist. And God help anyone who didn't adhere to her standards. She'd storm into HOA meetings, making veiled threats about compliance and legal actions for the slightest infractions. It wasn't long before I started to feel like we were always being watched. Every time I mowed the lawn, I swore I saw her peering out her window, clipboard in hand. It was exhausting, but that's when I realized this wasn't just about the lawn. There was something more personal behind it. The more I thought about it, the more I realized Karen's obsession with us wasn't just about rules. There was something deeper, something I hadn't yet uncovered. At first, it was just small stuff. A note about the garden needing immediate attention, or a reminder to trim the tree that had grown a little too tall. Annoying, sure, but nothing to lose sleep over. But over time, the fines grew more frequent, and the rules seemed to stretch further. It wasn't just about lawn care anymore. It became a game of micromanagement. I got a fine for the color of my patio furniture. Apparently, olive green wasn't HOA approved, and I was instructed to repaint it, or else. They even told me I had to replace the plants in my front yard because they didn't fit the community's aesthetic. No joke. Then came the inspection notice, the one that set everything in motion. They claimed our driveway was too cracked and that it violated HOA standards. I knew the driveway wasn't perfect, but it was nothing that posed any real hazard. Yet, they gave me a deadline to fix it or face another fine. I tried to reason with them, telling them it was an issue I was planning to address when I had the funds. They didn't care. The fine arrived days later. And it wasn't just me. Several neighbors spoke about the overreach and their sudden fines, picking apart the smallest details that were never an issue before. It seemed like they were getting bolder with each passing month, more aggressive, more demanding. Karen didn't even bother to act like she was following any real rules. It was all about her personal preference. At meetings, she'd shrug off concerns with a flippant comment or simply insist that the rules are the rules. It got to the point where I couldn't even look out my window without seeing Karen's silhouette lurking, clipboard in hand, waiting to catch anyone slipping up. It was like living under constant surveillance. No one was exempt, but the tension between us, it seemed, had only grown with time. I began to wonder, was it all just petty revenge for my past defiance, or had I become a target? I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just petty revenge. It was personal. That feeling gnawed at me. But the truth was, I had no idea just how deep this grudge went, or how far Karen was willing to go to make me pay. It was a Monday evening when the final straw landed on my doorstep. Another damn notice, this one marked in bold red. Urgent, final notice for immediate action. The envelope felt like a weight in my hands as I tore it open. The complaint? My fence was out of compliance. A small section of the wooden fence in our backyard had fallen over during a storm a few weeks ago, and I hadn't had a chance to repair it yet. It wasn't a huge deal, just a piece of wood. But to the HOA, it was a violation of their so-called community standards. The letter wasn't just a warning this time. It came with a $200 fine, and they threatened to escalate matters to the local authorities if I didn't fix it within 7 days. I couldn't believe it. This was the breaking point. A fence that didn't even affect anyone else. But it wasn't just the fence anymore. It was the tone of the letter, the sheer audacity of them to control every detail of my life. My frustration reached a boiling point. I'd had enough. I'd tried to reason with them in the past, spoken at meetings, sent emails, but each time they brushed me off. This time, I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I stormed into the next HOA meeting, fully prepared to confront them. The room was full of the usual suspects, Karen at the front, looking smug as always, the rest of the board sitting quietly. I stood up, heart pounding, and laid the letter on the table. "This is ridiculous," I said, my voice steady but full of anger. "You fined me for something minor, something you know doesn't even affect the neighborhood. You're pushing people too far." Karen gave me a tight smile, her usual passive-aggressive tone dripping as she spoke. "Rules are rules," she said, without a hint of empathy. "If you want to live here, you need to follow them." The room grew tense. I felt every eye on me, but I wasn't backing down. The meeting quickly spiraled into an argument, my voice growing louder as I pointed out the HOA's overreach and hypocrisy. I was so angry that I barely noticed the paper in my hand shaking. Little did I know, that argument would be the spark that lit the fire, and soon, things would get out of hand. What happened next wasn't just a petty escalation. It was a full-on power struggle that no one in the neighborhood could have predicted. The knock on the door came a few days after the HOA meeting, and it was earlier than I expected. I had just gotten back from work, my mind still spinning from the confrontation. The frustration hadn't left me, but now it was mixed with a growing sense of dread. When I opened the door, there they were. Two uniformed police officers, standing on the porch with a seriousness that sent a chill through me. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to mask the confusion in my voice. One officer stepped forward, his posture rigid, his hand holding a clipboard. "We need to speak with the owner of the property," he said, his tone matter-of-fact, almost cold. My heart began to race. What the hell was going on? Why the police? I had no idea where this was coming from, but the pit in my stomach grew larger with each passing second. "I'm the owner. What's this about?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Neither officer responded directly. They just exchanged a look, then handed me a document from the HOA. The paper was familiar. It was from the same people who had been fining me for every little thing. But this time, the stakes seemed higher. The officers weren't here to warn me about a fence. No, this was different. "We were instructed to deliver this in person," the officer with the clipboard said, his voice almost robotic. "There are serious matters at hand. We need you to comply with the HOA's demands immediately." I couldn't wrap my head around it. Serious matters? What could possibly be so serious that it required the police? I felt my hands tremble as I glanced down at the paper, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't clear, just a vague reference to an urgent situation. No specifics, no explanations. My mind raced, the tension thick in the air. The officers weren't offering any clarity. They just stood there, waiting for something. An answer, perhaps, or for me to make a move. "Look, I'm not sure why you're here, but I started. But before I could finish, the sound of footsteps came from behind me. The door swung open, and to my surprise, my wife stepped out from the hallway, in full uniform, her badge glinting in the sunlight. The officers froze. Their eyes widened, their jaws visibly dropped. The shift in their demeanor was instant, and I could see their brains scrambling for an explanation they never expected. The officers stood there, staring at my wife as she walked out onto the porch, her boots clicking on the wood. She was wearing her full uniform, dark blue, badge gleaming on her chest, gun holster at her side. Her expression was calm, but I could feel the shift in the air as soon as they saw her. The two police officers exchanged a glance, then looked back at her, their faces frozen in place. It was like the wind had been knocked out of them. The officer with the clipboard took a step back, his eyes darting between my wife and me, clearly trying to piece together what was happening. "Ma'am," the first officer stammered, his voice suddenly uncertain. "Are you?" "Yes," she said, her voice steady, authoritative. "I'm Detective Walker. And you are?" She didn't ask for their names. It wasn't a question, it was an order. The second officer swallowed hard, fumbling with his words. We were instructed to." "I know what you were instructed to do." She cut him off, her tone crisp. "But you're on my turf now, and the HOA's little drama has just become a legal matter." She stepped forward, blocking their view of me, as if to signal that the balance of power had just shifted. I watched as the officers tried to regain their composure, but it was clear something had broken in them. They weren't here to enforce the HOA's pettiness anymore. They were in the presence of someone with real authority. The officers exchanged another quick look, and I could see the nervous tension in their faces. Their posture was no longer rigid. They seemed unsure of how to proceed, as if the rules had just changed in a way they didn't fully understand. My wife stood tall, her authority oozing from every movement. The calm, confident way she carried herself made it clear they weren't calling the shots anymore. She was. "I suggest you go back to your superiors and inform them that any further action involving my family will go through the proper channels." "Is that understood?" she said, her voice sharp, no room for argument. I could see it in their eyes. Suddenly, they weren't sure who was in charge anymore. The officers stood there, frozen, as the realization sank in. But just when I thought this would be over, they made one last move that I wasn't prepared for. The silence stretched on as my wife stood there, arms crossed, her eyes locked onto the officers. They seemed to shrink under her gaze, the authority of her uniform weighing heavily on them. It was almost as if they hadn't expected anyone to stand up to them. Not like this, not in front of the very people they thought they could intimidate. The first officer, the one who had spoken earlier, cleared his throat. Detective Walker, we were just following orders from the HOA," he stammered, but his words lacked the certainty they had when they first arrived. They said there were some urgent matters that needed addressing." My wife tilted her head slightly, her gaze unflinching. Urgent matters? What matters exactly? She asked, her voice smooth, but carrying an edge that made it clear she wasn't buying any of it. The officers exchanged an uncomfortable look, both clearly unsure how to explain their presence. They had been so used to enforcing petty rules, issuing fines, and exerting control over every little detail in the neighborhood. But here, now, things were different. She pressed on, stepping closer, her posture unwavering. You do realize, don't you, that it's highly irregular for the HOA to involve law enforcement over something as trivial as a fence? Her voice was calm, but there was an underlying sharpness to it. Did you even investigate this before showing up at my door with a fine? The officers fumbled for words, clearly uncomfortable. They glanced at each other, and the second officer mumbled something about needing to follow protocol. But it was clear that protocol wasn't the issue anymore. They were caught in the crossfire between an HOA that thought they could do whatever they wanted and a law enforcement officer who wasn't going to let them. My wife's calm demeanor only intensified their discomfort. She wasn't raising her voice, but each word landed like a heavy blow. Slowly, she turned her attention to the paperwork they had brought with them, glancing at it with a cool, clinical disinterest. Tell me, she asked, why the HOA thinks it has the power to send officers on such trivial matters without any legal backing. How is this not harassment? The officers stood frozen, looking less and less sure of themselves. That's when the officers made a decision that would come back to haunt them. The officers' hesitation was palpable, but their next move would only make things worse, and I wasn't prepared for what would happen next. The tension was thick in the air as the officers shifted uneasily on the porch, clearly out of their depth now that my wife had taken control of the situation. But the uncomfortable silence didn't last long. Within minutes, the sound of tires crunching on gravel signaled the arrival of the HOA's president, Karen. I could see her through the front window, striding up the path with that familiar air of self-importance. She stopped in front of the officers and me, her heels clicking sharply with every step. The way she carried herself, it was as if she was walking into a meeting, like she had all the answers and control. She straightened her shoulders, then turned her gaze to my wife, clearly noticing the uniform and badge for the first time. The change in her demeanor was immediate. Detective Walker, Karen said, her voice tight, trying to mask the growing unease beneath her words. I'm Karen Caldwell, president of the HOA. I'm afraid you've misunderstood the situation here. She addressed my wife with a forced calm, as if trying to rein in the chaos her actions had unleashed. My wife didn't budge. Misunderstood? No, Karen, I don't think I have. The situation was crystal clear from the start. You've been using the HOA to push personal agendas, and now you've involved the police over something that doesn't even deserve a second glance. Offense? Really? Karen's face flushed, but she pressed on, her eyes flicking between the officers and my wife. I'm just trying to do what's best for the neighborhood, she said, but the edge in her voice made it sound less like an apology and more like an excuse. You know how these things are. We need to keep things in order. And what do you call this? My wife asked, gesturing at the officers awkwardly standing on the porch. Using law enforcement to enforce petty fines? If this is how you run things, it's no wonder people in this neighborhood are starting to speak out. Karen's mouth tightened into a thin line, but she had no response. The officers, clearly uncomfortable, shifted their weight. My wife wasn't done, though. You're abusing your power, Karen. And I'm going to make sure it stops here. If I hear one more complaint of this sort, I'll be getting legal counsel involved. You might want to reconsider your approach. Karen looked around, clearly realizing that she had lost all the ground she thought she'd gained by bringing the police into the situation. She glanced at the officers again, now fully aware that the narrative had shifted and there was nothing she could do about it. As she turned to walk away, defeated, I could feel the weight lifting. The power dynamic had completely shifted. The HOA's control was slipping, and they had no one to blame but themselves. But as Karen walked off, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much bigger battle. The days following the confrontation felt like a quiet storm brewing. The news of what had happened spread quickly through the neighborhood. Word travels fast in a place like this, and soon, people were talking about Karen, about the HOA, and about how they'd taken things too far. It didn't take long for the complaints to snowball. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out before began to voice their frustrations, some even showing up at HOA meetings to demand accountability. The once intimidating presence of the HOA began to crumble under the weight of their own arrogance. They had overplayed their hand, and now people were waking up to the fact that they had been bullied into compliance for far too long. I knew it was more than just my wife's influence that had changed the tide. It was the fact that, for once, someone had stood up to Karen and exposed the hypocrisy and pettiness behind the curtain. We weren't just talking about a broken fence anymore. We were talking about an HOA that had lost touch with the community it was supposed to serve. Karen's downfall was swift. First, there were whispers. People in the neighborhood began questioning her motives, asking why she had used law enforcement for something so trivial. Then came the formal complaints. Several neighbors, emboldened by the events, filed grievances with the city about the HOA's overreach. I didn't have to do much except stand by as everything Karen had tried to suppress unraveled. The tension was palpable at every HOA meeting, but the power Karen once wielded was slipping away. It wasn't long before the board members began distancing themselves from her. Rumors of her potential removal started to surface, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction as Karen's own allies turned their backs. But the real blow came when she was forced to resign, publicly humiliated, after a series of complaints were filed with the city over her abusive tactics. The sweet taste of justice hung in the air like a long-awaited breath. I couldn't help but grin as I watched Karen walk away from the HOA office for the last time. My wife, standing by me, shared a quiet, satisfied look. We had fought for what was right, and in the end, we had won. But as I watched Karen leave, I knew this wasn't over yet. The HOA's power may have been weakened, but the fight was far from finished. As I stood there, watching Karen leave the HOA office for the last time, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. It was as if the weight of all the months, all the petty fines, and the constant feeling of being watched had been lifted in that one final moment. It wasn't just the victory that felt so sweet. It was the realization that we had stood up for what was right, and in doing so, had exposed the lengths the HOA would go to in order to control us. My wife, standing beside me, was quiet. She hadn't needed to say much throughout the whole ordeal. Her presence alone had shifted the dynamic, and with a simple, calm assertion of her authority, she dismantled everything the HOA had tried to build against us. As we walked back home together, I could see the pride in her eyes, the same pride I felt. It wasn't just about the battle we'd won. It was about the unity we'd found in fighting for something bigger than ourselves. In a way, this whole experience had changed us. It had opened my eyes to the kind of power the HOA had wielded, not just over our property, but over the lives of everyone in this neighborhood. It had also shown me how fragile that power really was. When we stood up, when we stopped being intimidated, we not only regained our own freedom, but helped restore a sense of justice to the whole community. We were no longer at the mercy of a group of petty bureaucrats who thought they could control every aspect of our lives. As the days passed, I noticed a shift in the neighborhood. The oppressive air that had once hung over us seemed to lift. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down now began speaking up, sharing their own frustrations, and holding the HOA accountable. We had set a precedent, and now the power dynamics had been irreversibly changed. But even with the victory, something inside me told me this wasn't the last time we'd see them. In the end, I didn't just win. We both did. And that, my friends, was a story they would never forget. And that's it for today's story, folks. We've seen the power struggle, the drama, and the sweet taste of justice served. I hope you enjoyed this wild ride as much as we did. If you liked this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Let us know what you think, or if you've had your own HOA story to share.